One essential part of SwiftUI updating your apps correctly is view identity. View identity is used in multiple parts of your app, for example for each and the Identifiable Protocol, but also for something like confirmation dialogues, popovers sheets, and also focus, for example the text field focus. And this is the third part of a series where I talk about SwiftUI performance. Previously I talked how to debug, for example in instruments, how to correctly set up the data flow in your apps, and now it's view identity. You can find the link to the project in the description box, and I prepared a couple of examples that don't work so well and that we have to improve. Let's get started with the first example. I have here an array of fruit data, and each fruit has a name. On the screen I use a for each with a binding to this array to show for each fruit a text field where you can change the name. And in this case, because this data is not identifiable, I use the ID. When you use for each, you need to give an ID if the data is not identifiable. And in this case, I say I'm using here the name property to identify this data. And what it actually does is it adds a ID, and this explains binds a view's identity to a given proxy value. So you can explicitly set a different identity, but if you use something like a for each, it automatically uses this ID property to identify each of these entries. Why is this important? This helps SwiftUI to know which of your views changed, because it knows, okay, something in this data, in this fruit data changed, so I know I need to look for the text field with this data, and I need to update that one. Or if I add a new one, if I add here a new one, it knows, oh, I need to insert this one, this was created. Now, how do you choose these identifiers correctly so that your UI works properly? Let's add another fruit. And in this case, I have 3 fruit items with the same text, with the same name. So I have 3 items with the same identifier. And for SwiftUI, this is like having 3 times the same view. Let's see what happens if I type something. I can delete one letter, and it actually deleted it also here, and then one more, and then it stopped with the focus. You can also test this in the simulator, because then we see the text field even better. So this is the view that I added here to my main app. I create a new entry, I tap here. Now I tap, and now I change this and add tab here, and you see the keyboard disappears. Why is this? As I said, this text field, or this view inside this for each, is identified with the name of this fruit. This text field's focus is connected to this keyboard. Basically, the keyboard, there needs to be some information going back and forth. When I tap here something in this text field, it needs to update this text field. So these two are connected. And this connection is done with the identifier. When I change this text here, I change the name, I change the identifier, and then the text field's connection disappears. So this is definitely not something I want to have, because now I can't really type something. And it's not the fault of SwiftUI, it's mine, because I inappropriately here used an identifier that dynamically changes. So you need to use identifiers, as you see here, that don't change, otherwise my text field's connection here to the keyboard breaks up. And the other thing that I said is, if you have entries with the same identifier, let's just change this. You see, it changed it for the 3 text fields which had the same name, so they are 3 times the same row. In order to prove this to you, I created here a subview. SwiftUI actually reuses the same cells because they are the same, you use the same view, so it won't create 3 times the same view. But they are the same text fields. The underlying data doesn't appropriately show this. Okay, now let's work on our data to find better identifiers. So I go to this fruits model file, and we are going to use the Identifiable Protocol, which requires a ID property. So I use a var ID, a computed property of UUID, and we are using it now as another example, a computed property UUID. So I go back to my list, and this time I'm removing here this ID. So now it uses the Identifiable Protocol and this UUID. Okay, I add a new entry. And I wanted to now change one of them. I'm going to run this again in the simulator because the preview doesn't really like to work with the text fields. I add 2 more entries. And if you try now to use these text fields, you're not able to do this. That is because I use the computed property, and every time I try to create here one of this text field, it accesses the ID, but every time I call it, it's a new UUID, so it never can associate these text fields properly. So this is again the problem of having dynamic identifiers. In this case, it's unique, so I would be able to distinguish between these 2 text fields, but it's changing all the time. So this is also not the way to go. So we are creating a UUID. So this is a var ID UUID. If I now try this, I add 2 new and I select the last one. Now my text field comes up because the identifier is stable. So this connection between the text field and the keyboard is constant. And I can type here. I can also go to the other text fields and properly do this because I changed the string, but the identifier is always the same. I can also test this to see what views. I said there's actually, if you use the 2 views with the same ID, it uses the same ones. I am going to here uncomment a section where I added a scroll view with another for each. In this case, I still use the ID. So now these 3 text fields are there. I add this. And what I also did is I added here a little animation is visible. So this is a state property that is owned by the subview. During onAppear, I toggle this to true with an animation. And here you see here I have an opacity so that when this view appears, it comes into view. It takes 2 seconds. When I first added this, so if I now add one, you see it shines inside. And then the next one doesn't. My animation is not coming up. It doesn't. These here are using still the name as identifiers. And I said these 3 views use the same identifier, so they're at the same time for SwiftUI they're the same views. And basically it reuses the same views with the same state. Now if I change something here, you see the last one shines in again. And what happens, I'm going to use a print statement, let capital self dot underbar print changes. So we see here what funky things we created. Maybe I just rotate this. No, I add new. The first one was animating in properly because this was the first one with this text. The second one just comes in directly. Now I probably should have done this a little bit slower. Just start again. So initially my views come into a view. This subviews on the right, the first time you see add self and add identity is visible changed. This is because they're coming into view. So I do this onAppear and is visible changes. So this is the second time when I change this. So the first time you see identity, that means this view was created and it has a new identity, so it's a new view. And then the second time this happens is because onAppear and change is visible. So this views need to change because it is visible, this property changed. So now I press here add new again. And we see this view now being animated. So again, identity, new view with this type with a new identity. And then this is visible. Okay, second time, I don't get this print statement because so I don't create a new view, but I get another error. Sometimes it comes up, sometimes not. And this is important. You see the ID new fruit occurs multiple times within the same collection. This will give undefined results. As you saw, undefined results in this case means I don't have the animation for my second view because it reuses this first one, which already is visible to true. So now no more animation is going. Now what happens if I change this last one? And weirdly enough, I see the animation now. My print statements down here tell me something interesting, and that is, it gives me the add identity. Add identity means it creates a new view. Why? Because I changed this text or the name. I changed the name of this fruit, which means that the identity for this view is different than the other one. The one I had previously disappeared. So it creates a new view with a new identity, and the old one is gone, and the old one's state is also gone. So because I didn't do the identifying here right, I lost the old state. So I go back to false and animate in. Can do this again. I have 2 fruits with the same name, and I change the last one. Now again, you see here I change something and I lose some state. And in this case, I lose the state that is related to my animation. So sometimes it pops in and sometimes not, because it creates new views all the time when I change the name, which I use as identifiers. So this is another thing to remember. The idea of these views is used to know, or it's the same view to know, or I need to add something or not, or I need to update the same view, or I need to throw away the old one and create a new one, and then you lose state. So I remove this here, or we can also say I use the ID property, or we just can leave this out. Okay, now this came in nicely animated. I press here new view. And now they are nicely animated because these are for SwiftUI different views. And you see this also here. Every time I create a new one, it tells me here it went through this body, it created a new view, identity, new view, new identity. And it is visible changed afterwards because of this on appear. When I change something now here, it just updates this text, but it doesn't do I don't lose my state. This is doing it correctly. In order to test this state, because you saw I lose a state, this is connected to state, I created a view modifier. A view modifier that owns state, similar as before. On appear, I said this property is visible, and then I changed here the stroke of these 2 rectangles. So this animated background modifier, I have here a shortcut with test animated background where I apply this with an if debug flag. So let's use this. And again, here I add this to my subview. Test background. So they come into play and my state changes, so you see these lines. This comes into play and this is working nicely. Whereas if I use again the name and I add here one more, now you see I don't have this border, although I added a new view or I changed something, and this one has these animations. So this is just another trick to know your state changes, where you know that this one shouldn't change. Okay, I'm going to just remove this for now to leave a good example. Now we saw how for each is using this identity of views from the data. This is also used in our second example. In the second example, here, this is in the fruit popover view. We're going to see how it's used for popovers. It's the same for alerts and so on. I need to uncomment this because now we have fruits properly identified. And in here, I'm going to add this popover. When you use a popover, the item with items property, this needs to be a binding to an identifiable instance. It's the same idea. It needs to identify this properly. Why? Let's just see this example. I have this actually works in the preview, not like the text field. So I have here a list with these 3 fruits. In this subview, I have a button. When I press this, I set this selected fruit to this fruit, which is connected to this popover. When this item binding here is not nil, then this popover is shown and we get here actually the fruit, and I added here a button. So if I tap here, I can say and change something. In order to see this as a popover, for example, because I only have here a small button, I use the presentation compact adaptation popover, so that when I now open this, I see the small popover and I can press this button. Okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to change the identifier to a randomly new one. This is actually self.fruit. This is the one I have here. Okay, we open this popover, I press this button, and it closes. Why does it close? Again, I use here a let underbar self. I use the preview ones, delete, clean here this. Okay, I open this kiwi one. Then I set here fruit. this is now calling this 3 rows because this one fruit is used in this array and then the whole array changes. But I only changed here one property. I didn't. 2 of them have self. That means they just called one property change or one dependency change, the fruit. And the other one, I see here again this identity. So my identity of this row changed, which is obvious because I updated here this identifier. That I definitely shouldn't do. And one way of reminding yourself of doing this, every time you use an identifier, just make this a let constant. This is protecting it from, you can only set it during initialization and then never again. So this is great. We don't want to change anything. And now it gives me an error. You're not allowed to do this. Great. So I save myself from doing these mistakes. What happened before when I pressed this button is I changed the identifier of this fruit here, which is also used for the selected fruit. And the connection of this popover to this button, to this viewer, is over the identifiable data that I gave here. Because I changed the identifier, these two, the text field here and the popover, are not connected anymore. So it basically lost this and it's like, oh, where's the viewer this is belonging to? I don't have this anymore. And then I better close here this popover. That is why when you use popovers or alerts, anything with these items, sheets, you always have to also use this identifiable data. So it knows how to connect the views to this presentation styles. Okay, this is working now great. These were probably examples that were quite simple. And you might already know, oh, this is not something I would run into. So I'm showing you one where I made this mistake. I created a view where I create a linear gradient and I want to have the user select the gradient colors. I have here a button to add a new color. So now this is going from red, green, blue to red again. I can press here and change the color. I'm going to use the first one. So now purple. I'm going to use the last one because this is the one on the corner. So I can change this. The first one, it did change, but the last one's not anymore. Again, when I select this, the first one always works, but not then afterwards, not anymore. You can also test this on the iPad because then it's the color picker is using a popover. So we see which views maybe are updated a little bit better. So I add another color. So now I have red, blue, green, red. I select this color. I did a change. And now both the first and last are changed. But now if I try again, it doesn't. The popover is still connected to this picker, but I can't update this properly. Try the green one, yellow. Again, it updates, but then not anymore. So I clearly did something wrong because my connection here, the updating of these colors is messed up. So what did I do to get to this point? I have here an array of colors. The first view is a linear gradient where I just pass the colors in this array. That's why they are shown like this. From the bottom starting point to the top leading endpoint. Maybe I should have done this the opposite. So we actually see top leading and bottom trailing. So now you see I start at the top leading. Here is red and this is the first color. Did I update and then somehow not anymore? In the list, I have a button that appends a new color, and right now I'm just adding here the red color. So now I have 2 red ones. And I have a for each that lists all these colors. SwiftUI colors are not identifiable by themselves, but I thought, let's try if I can actually use the color itself as an identifier. So I use ID self. Then in this for each of these colors, I use color picker where I pass the binding to this color. So now what's happening? When I am opening this picker here, the connection, this color picker is connected to the ID to the color itself. When I tap here, okay, maybe I should have used one that is a little bit more unique. When I tap a different color like purple, the color changes, which means that the identifier changes, which means that this color picker, what is shown in this list, and the popover color picker are off because they're connected to two different data points. So that when I try to set something here, it lost the connection. Similar to my popover before, I lost here something. Only in this case, it doesn't close this popover automatically. That's why I'm like, why is this not updating? So, and it's a little bit more tricky to see. The other thing that you saw is because in some cases I had 2 times the same color. When I used update this here, it has 2 times the same view. And now, although I want to pick the last color, it updated this the one before last. So because it's like, which one is which one now? Which one is which color? Because you use so many of the same. If you want to debug this problem, again with the print statements, you can't do this in here and for each create a subview. So then file private struct custom color picker. This is a view. And I just wanted to move this over there, and which means I need to have the data, which is a binding var color to a color type. So I can use now my custom color picker with this color. And because now I'm in the subview correctly, I can use here let underbar self-print changes. When this view appears, I have 3 times new views for this custom color picker. This is my red, green, and blue colors. Now if I add one more, you see I actually didn't get 4 views. I only got them 3 times. And all of them are at self, so it thinks self changes because my color array changes. But no new one is created. So it only thinks in 3 views, red, green, and blue, so that when I am using here the last one, it thinks it only has the first one. So that when I tap here, the first and last one are now updated together. So this is part of the undefined behavior challenge if you don't use identifiers correctly. So sometimes it's off, sometimes it's not updating anymore. In the discussion as before, we need to have a stable identifier. For my little example, I definitely can't use here color identifiers themselves. And I can't add a property to color because this is protected. So we are creating a color wrapper or a color data. So this SwiftUI color data. I need SwiftUI because I need to use color. This is a struct color data identifiable. The one property I care about is a var color of type color. And then I need to have an identifier, and we're just going to use the same as before, a UUID. And I create a new UUID. Okay, now I need to test this, and I don't want to do this in here, so you still have one bad example. So we are creating a new view, color data list view. I go back, and first we need to define our state. So we had here 3 colors. Instead of the colors themselves, I need to use here my color data. So this is color data with color initializer. So this is red, green, and blue. Okay, then the second thing I needed to do is having here a VStack that shows the gradient. So let's copy this. Now where do I get the colors? Because they're in there. I use a computed property to get a color array, and I use the color data and a map function to transform this from color data back to say we are returning here $0.color. So now I transform this from color data to the type I need, and which is colors, and we have our color gradient back. Okay, the second thing that I want to have is this color picker. So I need to have this VStack again around it, and a list with a button where I can append a new color. So this is now a color data, append a new color data with red. So we're adding the same. Then we're showing here for each with a binding to this color data points, color data. And my custom color picker, let's just use also another one. I have here file private, so I can use the same name in both files. The only difference is that I use here the color data, so that I have here a binding to these colors. Probably should rename this to not have the same. And I can remove the ID. This is also, let's try this again. I add another color. And I am changing the first red to purple. This is great. It's updating there, not in the last one. And I can continuously here change this. Because now it knows this is the same view with the same data. Then this one, the ID is the same because you still use the stable unique identifier, UUID. It's stable now, it doesn't change whenever I change here in contrast to before. And it's unique. So I can have multiple times the same red color without update them on the wrong position. As I said, it needs to be stable. Don't change during runtime like my color when I use the color picker. And unique, so I don't have the same identifiers like the same red color. Identifiers need to be unique and stable. When you're debugging this problem with identity, then I found that using this print statements here is the best, because now when every time I did something, self changed. Self means that a property in the subview changed, so this data changed. This dependency to this color data changed. But the view itself with this identity didn't change. This concept is a little bit weird to get grasped in the beginning. And it's a little bit difficult. So let's go through an example that is maybe a little bit more clear. The problem with the SwiftUI View Identity is which views are which, and identifying them and changing their properties, updating the UI to see this difference. The example I'm using is here a little sock tracker. I have here three different socks, and I want to see how many days I wore them so that I know when I have to wash them. I have a black pair, a white pair, and a gray pair. I can press here on this worn today button, and then this one days shows 1. I update this more and more. You also see that this image gets a little bit more gray because I added here an overlay with this gray color. Depending on how many days I wore them, they get more gray. So I can do this also with the other one. I can say I washed one sock individually, or I can say washing day and all of them are clean. In this example, because I have here 3 visually distinguishable socks, I personally can identify in my pile of socks which socks is which one. Identifying them by the color is good enough for me. But you usually buy socks in a pack of multiple, so I probably have multiple pairs of the same type of socks. So I have probably multiple pairs of black socks. So now down here I added 2 more pairs of black socks. In real life, you have the problem that you don't know which one updated, which one changed and got more smelly, and which one is the same one. Because then one day, the first day I wear my black socks, and then the second day I also wear the same black socks. The same, exactly same, or the same type of socks. And this, when I say the same and the same socks, is reflected here in this self and this identity. So let's add a print statement again. Let underbar self dot print changes. Okay, now when I say worn today, my existing socks change. One of their properties change, self changed. They got a little bit. One of them got more smelly. So the self, the self. I always want to say this in German because it's easier. Dieselben, this same socks, the self socks changed. One property, one dependency in this view changed. In this edit rows view changed. Whereas if I say I add a new pair of black socks, this array changed, that's why you see more print statements. About one of these rows, the identity changes. I have a new black pair of socks with a different identity than I had in the first one. For SwiftUI, it's for us, we see here we have different colors, but for SwiftUI, because I don't identify here with these colors, I identify with UUIDs. So let's just jump to definition. I again use the UUID. So this is good enough for SwiftUI to know which socks is which one. You could have a little code printed in your socks and a barcode reader where you know, oh, this is this socks and this is this socks. Or you could just write Monday to Sunday to identify your socks uniquely, so you know if you wear the same socks every day or the same socks every day. Okay, so again, when I add here a new pair of socks, one row is added, one more added socks view is added with a new identity. So this is a different pair. In SwiftUI, it thinks in types of views. So it has a new added socks raw view with a different identity, whereas the other three views still have the same identity, just one property changed a little bit. For example, one got a little bit more smelly. This is one property, one dependency that changed. So if you see only self, it means the property changed, like the smelliness of the socks. If you have a new identity, it means you have a new different pair of socks, or a different view. It's the same view type, just with a different identity. Usually when you have SwiftUI scroll views, you add constantly new views depending on how many you need to show. So in this case, you see a lot of identity when you scroll, when you add new views, because now they are created. In case of our animation problems, I already solved this, we also saw a lot of identity print statements. Because then I changed this text, which is used as the identifier, so it thinks it's a new view, and then I lose this, I lose my animation states. So if you just change properties of data that is used in this rows, and you see identity, then you're in trouble. Whereas if I have here whereas here I see self, and the socks changed themselves, so the one that I show here, this is the one that changed, then this means SwiftUI knows it's the same view, it can keep this view, its lifecycle, it keeps the state that belongs to this view. It doesn't need to allocate new work for creating states. This is also expensive. It can do better performance, and also if you have changes, animations between different view state, it also can keep that one. So in summary, if you want to test your identifiers, if something updated correctly, or you see some undefined behavior of things don't updating correctly, or pickers or popovers don't work together, just have a look if you see a lot of this identity changes. You don't create new data, you should only update some of this data. For example, here the smelliness, how many days the socks are worn, the smelliness changed, so the self changed, not the sock itself, the identity of the sock changed. Because there's quite a lot of things to look after when you use SwiftUI with different best practices, I created here a little checklist which you can have a look at, giving you a summary of all the things that you might need to consider when you work with SwiftUI. And there's one page where it's all about view identity. So this is a summary again of what we had. Don't use dynamic identifiers, use stable ones, use unique ones, or even worse if you both have dynamic and non-unique ones. You can find a link to this checklist in the description box of this video. This is the end of the third part of the series. In the next one, I'm talking about how to optimize list and table performance. For example, don't use conditional views inside of for each. Don't compute complex things inside the body of your views. So if you don't want to miss this, don't forget to subscribe to my channel, or I will link this video if it's already published. Thank you for watching. Until next time, happy coding.